Hello, everyone. My name is Bright Leslie, and I'm here to talk about vulnerabilities in open source software. Open source software is everywhere. This is publicly available software that is free, relatively free, under some certain licenses. Society depends a lot on open source software, so this puts us in a critical position. Let's take a look at some of the organizations that are core to open source software. ARPANET. So this is a foundation that basically founded the internet, you could say that. And the internet is inherently an open source project. And this ARPANET Foundation practices peer review, collaboration, and openness. Now we could talk about Linux Foundation. The Linux Foundation was founded in 2000 by a merger between open source development labs and free standards group. Linux became standardized and is the heart of many important systems today. Open source licenses. There are two main categories of open source licenses. We have the copyleft license, which basically binds that any piece of code is free. And if you modify the code, whatever you come up with is bound by the copyleft license. But that is a strong copyleft license. We also have a weak copyleft license, which is kind of open-ended. The permissive license is synonymous to the weak copyleft license, where people can make changes, but they are free. A few open-ended restrictions. Let's talk about license provisions and coverages. There's no single framework or template for licenses. Open source software is literally covered by whatever the author chooses as a license. So whoever chooses to use this software must look at this, analyze and understand the coverages, and follow it legally. Let's take a look at an interesting quote from Rodriguez. He said, regardless of the open source license used, it's important to remember that an open source license creates enforceable copyright conditions, and that copyright holders who engage in open source licensing have the right to control the modification, distribution of the copyrighted material. Now, this quote comes from an interesting case between Robert Jacobson and Matthew Katzer and Kamid Associates. So KAM, they created a proprietary software which used Jacobson's piece of open source code without attributing Jacob. So Jacobson sued KAM, and the JMRI, which is the Java Model Railroad Interface, which is the open source project that Jacobson manages, won the case. Now let's take a look at some organizations that keep an eagle eye on the open source software community. So we have the Synopsys Research Center, which is a cybersecurity research center, which deals with the acceleration of information, identification, exploitation, and mitigation against active vulnerabilities. They are also an active contributor in the open source community. They carried out an audit in 2021, and we see some very interesting statistics here. The first one is that there's a widespread use of abandoned open source components across all industries. So companies must do well to maintain their code base and keep it constantly updated. And it says over 90% of the audited code bases contain open source components with license conflicts, customized licenses, or no license at all. And it just shows the murkiness and the complexity of how, licenses are not, honored, and like in many cases, not legally challenged. The last one here is the 98% of healthcare sector code bases contain open source. And then out of the 98%, 67% of those code bases contain vulnerabilities. This is a high number in a very sensitive sector. So let's take a look at open source vulnerability events. As we saw in the Synopsys report, open source code often has vulnerabilities. Hackers are always constantly trying to find new vulnerabilities, zero-day exploits, in order to attack different entities. There's high risk of over-dependency of open source software because code can never be bulletproof. We've had cases of companies release code that has severe vulnerabilities. Let's take a look at some different attacks. We all know about Log4j attack that happened recently, and I'm going to talk about that later in the presentation. But let's talk about Heartbleed attack. So the Heartbleed attack was an attack on the OpenSSL, where the OpenSSL cryptography library was hijacked, and this actually happened for 2 years without discovery. We have other interesting package attacks, mainly on the JavaScript npm package. We see that the Twilio npm package was hit with malware, and they could effectively do a reverse shell and take access of someone's machine. And then the npm colors package was also injected with malware to print jargon, and just I think this was done as a retaliatory act by an open source author to protest corporations. So let's talk about the software supply chain risk. The software supply chain deals with the logistics, technologically, or you could say the life cycle of how code is distributed. Many entities participate in this flow, and many of these components are open source. Hence, they're left to depend on third-party dependencies, which possess general security and maintenance barriers. The term supply chain stems from the dependencies. So a piece of software can depend on a bunch of many others, and that creates a chain of flow. So basically, many enterprises have systems that depend solely on mainly on open source technology. We see hackers consistently trying to attack different spots in the supply chain, bring many critical systems down that depend on it. And as Synopsis said, there was a 650% increase in next generation cybersecurity attacks against open source tools in the period of a year. A successful attack in any link of the supply chain can propagate the compromised code or component downstream, completely unnoticed, and cause mayhem across different stages, said Aridar. We can see that's like a domino or ripple effect, as you may say. The SolarWinds attack was a classic example as the hackers gained access to sensitive information by injecting malicious code in the Orion monitoring software. Many other systems were affected. In general, managing the software bill of materials for your software and consistently monitoring any third-party packages that's being used, using available tools to help in detection are always good advices for those using open source. Nation-state cyber attacks are a growing concern in our societies, and they're often referred to as APTs, advanced persistent threats. The motive behind most of these IPs, or when nation states try to get an undue advantage over a different nation. We talked about Mandiant earlier in the semester where we talked about APT1 of the Chinese espionage. And while Log4j was actively taking place last year, while the exploit was discovered, it was discovered by Mandiant that there was an activity by APT41, which is the code name for a Chinese state-sponsored espionage group. And they were actively exploiting Log4j, and they were able to break into 6 local government systems. Aside APT41, other nations like North Korea, Iran, and Turkey were also actively exploiting it. Corporations have open source software in the heart of many of their systems, so definitely they are not left out of being vulnerable to cyber attacks. We see that corporations mostly participate with the communities in collaboration to ensure that the attacks are mitigated and well managed. They're mostly obliged to manage their dependencies and patch vulnerabilities as they occur. But there's an interesting dynamic where companies try to hide their code, and try to work in silos because of intellectual property. Log4j is a popular Java-based logging tool. A vulnerability was discovered last year, 2021, on the 9th of December. And with these vulnerabilities, attackers could use a line of code and take control of the exploited systems. And this gave it a severity score of 10. Every tool which used Log4j, which there were numerous number of them in the open source community, had to be patched. It was a thing of critical time. So there were no defined, frameworks or policies when it comes to vulnerability events. So we see a concert of collaboration between the open source community, the private sector, and the government in unison to make progress with reducing the attack vectors. The FTC released a statement on the 4th of January, 2022. And in the statement, they laid out how it is legally required for companies, businesses, private individuals to patch the vulnerability in line with the FTC Act and the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. They also spelled out the repercussions for not carrying out such patches. They talked about how they are ready to use the much legal extent they have, as they did with the Equifax, where Equifax had to settle and pay a $700 million fine because they did not patch their vulnerability on time. Here we see an interesting case. Daniel is the core maintainer of curl, and it seems one of his services used Log4j. His email was found, and a corporation reached out to him 42 days after the Log4j exploit was made public. So they reached out asking a bunch of questions about dependencies. I think it's really embarrassing that a company, would want to reach out to a single, entity out there as an open source author to ask these various questions. So he replied saying that he'll be happy to answer their questions once there's a partnership set up. He redacted the name of the company to prevent any kind of legalities if they had a partnership in the future. So they reached out back to him in this email, and they got his name wrong. They said, "Hi, David. His name is Daniel. Thank you for the reply. Are you saying that we're not a customer of your organization? And Daniel responds, and he responds saying, "Hi, Goliath." And he goes on to talk about how they're not customers and they don't have a relationship. So he's not obliged to answer any of the questions. They have to go do some research themselves. We see a classic story of David and Goliath. And David for sure had his stones because he exposed the name of the company later to be MetLife, which is a $700 billion life insurance company. In conclusion, it is evident that there's a lot of complexity when it comes to policies and open source software. Trying to set up many policies might stifle innovation. Vulnerabilities, we all agree, would always exist. So it's important for us to have information asymmetry across all state actors and have more collaboration between all the communities in the cyberspace. Thank you.